Well, in the story of Job, his life up until this point had been happy and full and rich and righteous, but now he's been blasted with unbelievable loss and suffering. And what used to seem like a good and happy world under a good and just God now started to seem to Job like the whole thing was chaotic and senseless. Job started to get suspicious that maybe God was running his universe poorly, that God was behaving cruelly, and he started to think that God doesn't care, that God isn't involved, and that God maybe is up there making our lives miserable just for sport. And so Job, in a dialogue with his friends, pours out his complaints about God. He tells it like he's feeling it. He says God seems like he's hunting him, shooting his arrows at him. And even if he could speak to him, then God would just bully him and bowl him over and hit him some more. And so the whole thing seems futile to Job. Job believed in God's existence, but he no longer trusted in him. He no longer had any real relationship with him like he did before. The great desire of his heart was that he would have that relationship again, but now it was gone. And Job, as he suffers, he says some things about God that he later regrets, according to chapter 42, verse 6. But he never gives up on God. He never gives up his pursuit of God. He says, in effect, this is not how I think the world should be if God is good, but he keeps clinging to him. He keeps wrestling. He never says this world is chaotic and therefore there is no God over the whole thing. He continues to contend for the faith, even though he's being coached to curse God and die. And so Job's story for us is instructive when we're suffering and when we can't explain it. I mean, for all of the foolish things that we might think, even the sinful things, for all the ways that we might sin in our pain, we're called to at least cling to God, to at least seek that relationship with him when he doesn't make sense, to at least wait for him. And to know that he's merciful and kind and forgives as we confess, even those sinful things that we said to him or prayed to him or thought about him as we went through our trials. He wants us to keep clinging to him. He does know what he's doing, and in the end, we won't be disappointed, though we may be angry and confused by his ways right now. And so these words that God speaks at the end of Job are some of the ingredients that God uses to mix into our thoughts to sustain our faith so that we can persevere with God even when we suffer. Because not only was God not a bully like Job said he would be, but he was kind. And God's response to Job at the end is definitely stern. He doesn't let Job get away with incorrect thinking. He reminds Job of Job's smallness and his ignorance of how the world works, and he gently nudges Job into his place, but he also draws Job in. He questions him. He answers him like a friend, and he points to some real answers for Job's questions about God's goodness. And God is doing all this because he's gracious. God doesn't answer to Job, but still he does answer Job. And by extension, he answers us. And the truth is that in our despair, in our suffering, in our trials, in our crises, we can start to see the world the same way that Job saw it. That the whole thing is just chaotic, it's a senseless mess, God is just arbitrary in the way that he runs this thing, it just doesn't work. And what can sometimes make that worse is that we can believe some of the false promises that Christians gave us. And depending on what your background is, you may have been in a place where Christians essentially said that if you follow God's wisdom, if you follow the rules, if you follow the system, then things will be guaranteed to go well for you. And then when we follow the rules and follow the system, we do the right things we thought we were supposed to do, and things don't go well for us, we can feel like God isn't governing the world the right way. We can feel like he's messing this whole thing up. And so, for example, if we believed that if we parented a certain way, our kids would turn out great, there's some truth to that because there is biblical wisdom for parenting that often does bear good fruit, but sometimes, even following all the rules, it doesn't bear good fruit. And it's easy to think God doesn't run the world the right way because the system didn't work. Or maybe we thought that if we honored God with how we dated or didn't date, that our marriage would be stellar. And again, there are commands from God for our purity. There's wisdom from God on how to honor relationships. And often following those things bears good fruit because the God who made the instructions is the one who made the world. He knows how the world works. But sometimes we do everything right, and then the outcome isn't right. It's not what we expected. And we can start to think God is cruel. He's senseless. He's unjust. He doesn't reward the good and punish the bad like he should. The whole thing is just arbitrary. And we can get a little disillusioned or a lot disillusioned with God. Or we followed biblical wisdom for managing money. We were cautious about debt. We were responsible. We were hardworking. And often that does make things go better for us in that category. But also sometimes there are job losses and car crashes and lawsuits and roof leaks and health problems that mean that no matter how responsible we were, no matter how many cash envelopes we stuffed, and no matter how many debt snowballs we rolled, we end up in bad shape at the end of it. And it can be so frustrating that we think God is not running the world the right way. Or maybe he is, and I'm just cursed. Maybe this is all just aimed at me. He's shooting his arrows at me specifically. And within the Bible, there's a huge body of wisdom literature. There are books like Proverbs where we're going to steep ourselves for most of this summer. And the message of Proverbs is this is wisdom. This is the way that the world works. Follow wisdom and things usually work out for you. But there's also wisdom literature like Ecclesiastes and Job that tell us, but things don't always work out. That even if you follow wisdom, even if you do things right, creation isn't what it's supposed to be. It's like all of creation is like that car that got in a car wreck and they repaired it, but it was never right after that. Like the doors don't close right, it still makes noises, it was never the same. And they said it was better, but we know that it's not better. And that's kind of what creation is. Like we know what it should be, but it's also not what it should be. And in those times when the wisdom doesn't work, where we follow the rules and it doesn't go well for us, when we feel like the arrows are hitting us and it's unjust, we didn't deserve it, we can be very tempted to just walk away and say God doesn't exist or God isn't good. And so as God answers Job at the end of this book, his answers are for us too. Even though our suffering is smaller, some of the temptation is similar. And we started looking at God's first speech in Job 38, and some of the things that we observed as we walked through it, some things that we need to remember as we go through our suffering are that number one, God is kinder than we expect or deserve. God speaks to Job like his friends were speaking to him. He wasn't the bully that Job expected him to be. Number two, that God is attentive to his creation as the good creator. And God reminds Job of how much wisdom and care must go into making and sustaining everything by taking him on this tour of creation. And he goes from the top to the bottom. He shows him the constellations and then zooms right in on the little clumps of dust that stick together after it rains. So he shows that he is caring, he is attentive. He shows in all this that he's far above us and he can comprehend what we can't comprehend, so we're not in a position to be his judge. In these chapters, you do see the superior power and wisdom and understanding and eternality of God. Also, he shows that chaos and evil are allowed within creation for a time, but they're limited. God confines the sea. He tells the waves where to stop. God's plan is that chaos and evil would be allowed. It's not all neatly judged and eliminated right away, but even right now, it is restrained. It isn't the sum of creation, and it isn't the sum of your story, because number 5, there is still a lot of good in God's creation. God takes Job on this tour and shows him the beauty of the world that he hasn't been seeing because he's understandably consumed with his own problems. And then God also shows him that he limits not only evil as a force, but he limits evil people. That they have their night when they can do some damage, but every day he gives order to the morning, sets dawn in its place, turns on the lights to at least hit pause on their evil for another day. And so we'll pick up in chapter 38, and there are definitely parts of this that we're skipping over just because of the length of all of it. But God is walking Job through the creation to show him his care, the order, his plan, his goodness, his continued rule over all things. He's showing Job that the world is not what Job has come to believe that it is, and God is not the one that Job has come to believe that he is. And so Job 38, verse 22, he says, "Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain, and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man is, on the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste in the desolate land, and to make the ground sprout with grass. Has the rain a father? Or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth? And who has given birth to the frost of heaven? The waters become hard like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Now, one quick note on how to interpret stuff like this is that anytime that we're interpreting any part of the Bible, we need to observe what the genre is of the writing that we're reading right there. That the Bible is not all one type of writing. There are multiple types of writing. That God writes in different ways. He inspired different forms of literature to all go into the Bible. So sometimes we can read this and we can say, man, this whole book of Job, really, it's just ancient nonsense. Like, we've moved on from this. Don't we know that there is no storehouse for the snow by now? Like, there's nowhere we could go where there's like a silo with all the hail in it, or a storehouse for the snow. This is the way ancient people thought when they were ignorant. We throw this stuff out. We've moved on. We're more scientifically minded now. We understand the way that the world works. But this isn't making a claim that there is a literal storehouse of snow and hail. And we know that because this is a poem. Now, there are parts of the Bible that are very much historical narrative, and we interpret those as history. We interpret them on face value. They're saying what they say. We believe it. There are letters that are very straightforward. There's some more symbolic stuff like spooky apocalyptic texts. And there are poems that are meant to convey emotion but not make a statement about science. So even as, if it was Moses, even as he was writing this, he wouldn't have said, oh no, there is a storehouse for hail up in the sky where God keeps his hail. It's there. He wouldn't have said that because he was writing a poem. And it's important for us to know what the figure or what the type of speech is, what the type of writing is, because the type of writing actually affects the meaning of the passage. One author explains this by saying that in the newspaper, if you remember newspapers, there are multiple genres, that there are classified ads and there are also scientific articles. And if the headline in a classified ad says, "Steel sinks," then we know what that means. We know that somebody is selling stainless steel sinks. But if the headline in a scientific article says, "Steel sinks," it's saying something completely different. And because we know that those are different forms, we know that there's actually different meaning being conveyed by the forms themselves. And within the book of Job, there are several different genres and different parts, but this part where God is speaking here is clearly poetry. And you read poetry differently than you read a science textbook. There's a big difference between a poem about roses and a book on botany. I mean, both are good and both are true, but they serve different purposes, and we interpret them differently. I mean, the poem aims to convey a feeling and is less concerned with scientific accuracy, where a botany book is about analyzing and facts and genes and is not at all concerned with how you feel about a rose. So nobody reads a book on botany to try to be moved emotionally about roses, and nobody looks up poems on roses for gardening tips. But they're different forms that have different purposes. And how we interpret passages of the Bible is affected by what type of writing that passage is. And by the way, it says something about the vastness of God that all of these different forms of literature have to be used to describe him. That he didn't inspire the Bible just as a list of propositions and truth claims, but he inspired some of those. He also inspired historical narratives. He inspired wise sayings and poems and songs and letters and eyewitness accounts, prophetic writings, spooky apocalyptic texts. If the universe can't contain him, then our words surely can't. And so God uses all kinds of human language and forms to help us understand just a little bit of his magnificence. And the forms themselves are part of the meaning. Now, we have to be careful here. This can be misused because what can happen is we can read part of the Bible that's clearly written as a narrative, but it describes something that's pretty unbelievable, like someone rising from the dead. And we can read that and we can say, oh, well, that must just be a poem because I can't believe that would happen. But that would be dishonest. We actually have to be honest with the form of literature that it is. When you read those resurrection accounts of Jesus rising from the dead, nothing about them is poetic. They're written as eyewitness historical accounts. Jesus really did rise from the dead, even though that's hard for us to believe. But it's important to realize that there are other parts that are poetry that we don't have to take as literally. So we don't have to read about this storehouse for the snow and take it literally. It's a line of poetry couched in a poem. It conveys a feeling and a meaning that doesn't pretend at all to describe a literal place. So there is no storehouse for snow in the sky somewhere, but the Bible is true. Every word inspired by God. This is true poetry. And the danger is that if we try to take a hyper-literal approach to poetry, we could do a couple things. One is we could dismiss the Bible because we know for sure there's no literal storehouse for snow. The Bible says there is, so we need to chuck it. Or we could tie ourselves in knots trying to defend that no, there really is a literal storehouse of snow somewhere. But if we do either one of those things, we miss out on what the Bible is saying. Not every type of writing should be interpreted like a book on botany. So look again, Job 38, verse 22, he says, "Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war?" So God, in answering Job's complaint that the world isn't run right, says poetically that there's a storehouse for snow and hail where it's being saved for a day of battle and war. So somehow God preparing for this day of battle and war is part of his answer to Job's complaint. And so there's some significance to this. The hail is not just this natural occurrence, but it's being described almost like ammo that's being stored up. And it wasn't uncommon in the Bible at all for God to use hail as part of his judgment on evil people. And we saw it in Egypt when God sent the plague of hail. We see it in passages like Isaiah 30, verse 30, where it says, "The Lord will cause his majestic voice to be heard and the descending blow of his arm to be seen. In furious anger and a flame of devouring fire, with a cloudburst and storm and hailstones. The Assyrians will be terror-stricken at the voice of the Lord when he strikes them with his rod." So hail being stored up for a day of battle and war is not a scientific statement about a big hail silo up in the sky, but it's a poetic statement where God's saying something even more important, where he's describing himself as preparing for a day of judgment on evil. Which tells us a little bit more about how we can think about God as we suffer, and it seems so senseless and it seems so endless. One of the things it tells us is that God is not absent in being passive about evil. He's allowing some and he's restraining it, but he's also storing up hail for that day when he will go to war against evil and finally conquer it. And this symbolism is actually all over God's speeches here at the end of Job, where God is preparing for battle. God is strong, and that the story is not all written yet. In fact, even this imagery of God speaking to Job from a storm, which in his first speech in Job 38:1, it begins by saying, "The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind." Job 40, verse 6, when God starts his second speech, same thing. "The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind." So God is answering out of these storms. And again, 12 years ago when I last preached through Job, I thought that the thunderings and the lightnings and the storms, these existed just to be a raw display of God's power. That Job complained, he was a fault finder, and he needed to stop complaining, so God showed him his power, he showed him his majesty all over creation, scared him a little bit by thundering from the storm. He impressed Job with his power, and Job said, "All right, I'll be quiet," and that was the end of the story. Now, impressing Job with his power is part of what God is doing here, but it's definitely not all of it. God's actually kindly, even though he doesn't have to, answering Job's complaints specifically. Remember, one of Job's complaints is there is no limit on evil in the world. There's no limit on evil people out there. But God preparing for this day of judgment and battle is part of the answer. And in fact, this God speaking from the storm motif is all over the Bible. And there's often this theme where God is preparing to finally defeat his enemies, And then after that defeat, after that storm goes through, just like when a big rainstorm blows through, a couple weeks later, everything is greener and there's new life growing. God's promising, one, the defeat of evil, the defeat of his enemies, but then two, new life and growth and green on the other side of that. Let me just show you a couple of them. This is Jeremiah 23, verse 16. It says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, do not listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you, filling you with vain hopes. They speak visions of their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They say continually to those who despise the word of the Lord, it shall be well with you. And to everyone who stubbornly follows his own heart, they say, no disaster shall come upon you. For who among them has stood in the counsel of the Lord to see and to hear his word? Or who has paid attention to his word and listened? Behold, the storm of the Lord. Wrath has gone forth. A whirling tempest, it will burst upon the head of the wicked. The anger of the Lord will not turn back until he has executed and accomplished the intents of his heart. In the latter days, you will understand it clearly." So notice this storm of the Lord that's ready to burst in wrath on his enemies. Nahum 1:2, "The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his enemies and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power. The Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in the whirlwind and storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet." Zechariah 9:14, "Then the Lord will appear over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. The Lord will sound the trumpet and will march forth in the whirlwinds of the south. The Lord of hosts will protect them." So again and again throughout the Bible, and there are a ton more, there's this imagery of God judging his enemies from the storm on behalf of his people. Now remember, Job thought God was treating him like his enemy. In fact, listen to what he says God's doing to him in the storm. This is Job 9, starting in verse 16. He says, "If I summoned him and he answered me, I wouldn't believe that he was listening to my voice, for he crushes me with a tempest." So he had this idea that in the storm, God was crushing him. But in Job 38, God answers Job from a storm, and he doesn't crush him. He speaks to him like his friends are speaking to him. And he gives him the good news that he is preparing for that day when he will finally defeat evil. So a couple more things for us to cling to when we suffer. One, God is not passive or indifferent toward evil in the world. But then two, the story isn't over yet. One day, God will defeat evil. And this is big because sometimes when we suffer, we go through our bad situation and we think, my bad situation is the end of the story. I have a terminal disease and I will die, and that will define my story. I've experienced this crisis that's life-altering, and that defines who I am now. Now my life is ruined. My family problem seems like it's permanent. It consumes my thoughts, and this is all that my life will ever be. But we have to remember as Christians that there is more to come in all of our stories. God is storing up the hail, as it were. He's preparing for that day when he'll put an end to chaos and disease and sin and suffering and confusion. That we may think that evil's run amok, but evil will be punished. He'll end evil, and just like the land turns green in the weeks after a big storm, in the wake of that judgment, new life will come. And so as cheesy as it sounds, it's true for us as Christians that the absolute best part of all of our stories is yet to be told. We have to remember that we're in an epic story here, and right now, we're in the bad part of the story. We're in the part where there's conflict and obstacles and opponents and confusion. But that's never how the story ends. In fact, in all of history, God is telling this long, epic story with history, and this is one of the reasons that evil is actually allowed to be present, at least a partial reason that there is still evil in the world. Because a story that doesn't have any obstacles to overcome, a story with no enemy, no antagonist, that's a bad story. Like if the story is that the kids go to Narnia and make snow angels and come home, no one's gonna read that. Like that's not entertaining. You wouldn't go pay for that movie for sure. Like why would you watch that? But if they go there and they overcome a white witch because of the power of a good and not tame lion, Well, that's a much better story. And so God is telling a story that we're all in, and there are antagonists everywhere, but in the end, he'll triumph. True good will win. The enemies will be defeated. Suffering will end, and it will all end up for his glory and for our good. And we might look at our lives right now, and we might think that they're ruined by that thing that we're going through, but the story's not over yet. God's preparing for this day when all of our tattered stories are going to have a new chapter written in them. And when all of those unresolved plot points will be resolved. And when we'll worship God around the throne for telling with history the best story that's ever been told. God is ultimately over all of the times and all the seasons and will steer all of those things for his glory and for our good. And yeah, evil is out there having its fun right now, but there's coming a day of battle and war. When the hail of God's judgment rains down, evil's destroyed, and new life follows. So God, speaking from the storm here, is saying, your story isn't done yet. So if you look at your life and you say, I ruined it, I blew my one shot at having a great family, that defines my existence. God says it doesn't, because your story keeps going. If you sinned and you feel as a result you'll always be labeled and identified by that thing that you did, that's not forever. If you blew your chance at choosing a great career, if you've been falsely accused and everyone believes that you're evil and so that you've been isolated unjustly, or if you've ruined all of your relationships and you feel like you'll always be lonely and ruined, or you feel like evil is won, we have a great champion in Jesus who will defeat all evil finally one day. And we're just not to that part of the story yet. We have to be careful. None of this means that we should deny our suffering or pretend that our suffering isn't real. But we do need to put it in proper perspective. We do need to see it as having its place in a story that goes on forever. Because the way that all of our stories are trending is that there's coming a day when there will be judgment followed by renewal. The day of battle and war, and then afterwards there is good to come for Christians. And when you're the one that the storm is for, rather than the one that the storm is against, you have an awful lot to hope in. When we're going through a bad trial, it can be just all-consuming. Maybe you know it's like you're going through it and it seems like every day is consumed with thoughts of that one big problem that you're going through. And you have those few moments when you first wake up, when you don't really know who you are or where you are, and those are moments of peace. Like, I am so happy right now for about 5 seconds. And then you remember. And the pressure comes back on and you go through your day going through these problems and it seems like the whole thing is all-consuming. It's never ending. It seems like it only grows like a fire that won't stop until it's consumed every last bit of us. But this promise in Job is that it will end. And the promise is that for Christians, even if we die with our problems unresolved, we'll rise again. And that life and the resurrection will go on forever. So we're not denying the horrible things that we experience or how horrible those things are. But relative to eternity, they do shrink. So if in your life you go through a 50-year crisis, after you've spent 100 years with the Lord in glory, the 50 years looks a little bit smaller relative to your whole life. And then after you've been there 1,000 years, smaller still. In 1,000,000 years, and eventually it shrinks down to where it's still a plot point in your life, but all of our trials get shrunk and relativized in light of eternity. And this doesn't fix our problems now, it doesn't explain our problems now. It definitely doesn't mean that it's a sin to grieve and to weep and to feel pain. Jesus did all of those things. But eternity does relativize our problems. It does constrain them, and it does allow us to still have some hope while we go through them. And also, sometimes we don't find the purpose in our suffering. I mean, Job never sees in this book why he suffered. He never learns that as you go through the book. But sometimes one of the reasons God allows this life to be frustrating is so that again and again we go all in on Jesus and our hope of the resurrection. And so maybe our failure to ever achieve the comfort that we're after in this life is God's gracious reminder not to love comfort and ease here. Maybe it's part of his kindness to wean us off of all of the hopes that we have in this place. Maybe the futility and the inability we have to ever make life stable enough or secure enough or easy enough or drama-free enough and to make all of our relationships thrive, maybe our continued failure in all of those categories is God's grace to continually allow us to push our hopes toward Jesus and the eternity that we have with him. But whatever God's purpose is in our suffering, we know that what seems like it's out of control, what seems like it's unruly, what seems like it's all-consuming now just won't be forever because God will tame it and God is sovereign over it. So your suffering is a real plot point in your story, and it may define this season, but it will not define you. Because the one who rules over even the chaos promises that. And then you continue through chapters 38 and 39 in Job, and God takes Job on this tour, and he points out all of these aspects of his creation that show his sovereignty, his rule, his care, and his ability to tame the untamable. At the end of chapter 38 and through chapter 39, he lists 8 different animals, all of which are either untamable or hard to tame, and he shows that he's over all of them. So he mentions lions and ravens and mountain goats and wild donkeys, wild oxen and ostriches and horses and hawks. They all look chaotic. They all seem like unrestrained creatures. They don't seem to live according to order. You have these ostriches not caring for their young, chaos everywhere, and God's in control. So God shows Job his wisdom, his knowledge, his kind rule over creation, his goodness and his provision all throughout the world. That he's not the God who doesn't care and who loves to destroy creation, but he's the wise sustainer of creation. And so Job starts to see that again. Job made accusations, and now he's had his day in court. And God has shown him exhibit after exhibit to prove that God is not the evil, random agent of chaos that Job accused him of being, but is kinder, wiser, and more involved than Job ever thought. And so far, we've observed 9 things that God has taught Job and us to cling to when we suffer. When our suffering doesn't make sense, we don't know how we could ever continue to trust God. So far, we've seen that God is kinder than we expect or deserve. He's attentive to his creation as the good creator. He is far above us, and he can comprehend what we can't comprehend, so we can't judge him. The chaos and evil are allowed for a time, but they're also limited by God, which means that there is still a lot of good and a lot of beauty in his creation. And while it seems like they're in control, God limits evil people as well. God's not passive or indifferent toward the world. The story isn't over yet because God will one day defeat evil, which means that your suffering isn't your whole story. And again, these are not answers for why you're suffering. These are truths that you can cling to help you cling to God as you suffer. So Job made his case. God made his case. Job knows he lost. And so in Job chapter 40, verse 3, it says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, 'Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once and I will not answer, twice, but I will proceed no further.'" So Job says, "I'll be quiet now." And he actually uses courtroom language here, this "I lay my hand over my mouth." This is used to describe the moment that someone admits defeat. When they have no more arguments, they have nothing left to say. Job tried to claim that the world is chaotic and that God rules unjustly. God takes him through the natural world and shows him that's not so. And Job realizes that his argument was refuted. And he decides to drop his case. But it's not because God bullied him, but God just graciously proved him wrong. And so Job's quiet. And this is good. This is a good place for him to be, but that's actually not God's whole aim. I mean, Job needed to be put in his place. He needed to be reminded that God's the creator and that Job is creation. Humility is good. But God's actually going to bring Job to a place where he gives him the desire of his heart. He's going to bring him back to worship and relationship with God. God's going to speak again, and that's going to be the speech that we look at next week, because at the end of that, we're going to see that Job is not just quiet, but he's loved, and he's worshiping. But for now, let's also not forget where this story fits in the broader picture. I mean, in Job, we have this story of this guy who suffers, and he suffers faithfully but imperfectly. He endures this suffering that doesn't make any sense. He gets angry at God. He accuses God of not caring, of not paying attention. But then you fast forward through the centuries, and God does something that really stops the mouths of anyone who would accuse him of not caring or not understanding. He does something completely unexpected. He becomes the sufferer. In a sense, he becomes a Job who comes and suffers perfectly, faithfully, never doubting his Father. Jesus suffered even more than Job. Job's suffering was constrained so that his life couldn't be taken, but Jesus fully gave his life. He suffered more, he gave more. And though all of this happened to Job unwillingly, Jesus willingly took it on. And so that means that whatever reason we can come up with for our suffering, and whatever we might think about God when we go through it, we can't look at Jesus and accuse God of not understanding. We can't accuse him of not caring. We can't say that he doesn't know what it's like, because he's been there. And while Job's suffering and the suffering that we go through is a reminder to hope in eternity, Jesus' suffering actually provided that eternity. Because remember the storm. It's scary if the storm of the Lord is arrayed against you. If the hail is stored up for his enemies and the storm is going to be thundered against his enemies, you don't want to be one of his enemies. But by nature, because of our sin, we naturally are his enemies. We're naturally on the wrong side of that storm. But on the cross, God's hailstones were thrown at Christ. God's storm was directed where we never expected it to go, not at his enemy, but at his son. His lightning was sent right into the heart of his son. He endured the storm so that we could experience the new life on the other side of it. And if we'll turn and believe in him, what we have in eternity is nothing but that new life. But if we won't, if we insist on remaining as enemies, then these hopes aren't ours. These are the hopes of those who've believed in him, who've had that storm absorbed by Jesus. And he absorbed it for all who would turn from their sin and unbelief and would turn to him. Which gives us great reason as Christians to hope.